Earlier this year, I participated in a conference here in Ohio, Creature Weekend, that was hosted by Bruce Harrington and Billy Willard. And I was moderating a forum on big cat sightings here in the state. And somehow or other ended up doing a talk on lesser known mystery animals, which also included a little discussion on what cryptozoology is and how researchers can best get their data out to the general public. And I wanted to go ahead and do a short video presentation of that talk because I don't plan to do it again at a conference, and there's some material here which I don't think has been published yet, so I want to go ahead and try this format. I want to start with what is cryptozoology. If you watch television, today, that you're going to see programs on cryptozoology, on Bigfoot, on Loch Ness, and that sort of thing. And you might get the idea that cryptozoology is just monster hunting. That's not really the case. Cryptozoology is the investigation of folkloric animals that are alleged to exist, but for which we don't have more than circumstantial evidence. So, cryptozoology, as Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans developed it, or at least his own idea of it, cryptozoology is a field of study within the larger boundaries of zoology itself, specifically focused on these alleged species and trying to determine whether or not they actually exist. The concept of cryptozoology as a distinct field of study is a little bit debatable. Personally, I don't like this particular concept. I look at cryptozoology as methodology rather than a field of study. And Dr. Heuvelmans actually touches on this in other areas of his writing. He understood it, as you can see here, as a search for animal species still undescribed. And so I don't think I'm too far off course when I suggest that this is the best way of looking at cryptozoology, instead of as a field of study, a distinct area like ornithology is the study of birds, or herpetology, the study of reptiles and amphibians. We can look at cryptozoology as a process. And I think this is a more succinct definition. Cryptozoology is a scientific methodology that is focusing on ethno-known creatures, and by that we mean animals that are folkloric. There is an ethnozoological recognition. These animals are distinct enough to be distinguished, to be recognized as something out of the ordinary, or at least not the same as other known species. And so if someone hears about such an animal, it is a potential target for the cryptozoological methodology. We would then attempt to determine whether or not there is a biological basis behind these stories, and if so, whether that basis is a species as yet undescribed. And then we would attempt to find enough evidence outside of circumstantial evidence. We're looking for more substantial evidence to attempt to actually be able to give that to a scientist for a scientific description. And we see here Dr. Heuvelmans gives a little bit of his idea of the methodology, how we look for information about a cryptid, and attempt to gather as much as we can about it, and hopefully find a way to track it down or get some kind of physical evidence that would allow for a scientifically viable description. Here's a shorter review of the methodology as I visualize it myself. We're first locating our target, and the target is the mystery animal. We have to know that it exists. There may be species out there for which we have no idea, that they may exist. They are completely hidden. There is no circumstantial evidence out there for them. Those are not cryptids. They are simply undescribed species. Once an animal has enough salience to be recognized, that's the distinguishing characteristics that set it apart from known species. Then someone may mention it to someone else. They may write it down. They may take a photograph of tracks or whatever, and that evidence gets passed around. It may end up just being story form, but that sort of creates this folkloric entity that we call a cryptid. And that is our target. We are going to investigate that mystery animal, knowing that, of course, that there may be exaggeration involved. There may be mistakes about what people see, and you have to be able to sift through all of that. But we're first going to gather as much information as we can about it: eyewitness sighting reports, environmental and habitat data. That sort of thing. We're going to evaluate the information. We're going to sift through, try to get rid of misidentifications, hoax reports. People pass stories along from one to another. That tends to either garner additional details that weren't in the original report. Sometimes details go missing. We're evaluating all of that. We're also looking at the habitat data and whatnot to try to figure out when and where we can actually go out and look for such a creature. And eventually you're going to do field work to try and acquire the necessary evidence, the sufficient evidence, not just circumstantial evidence, to confirm that this animal does exist and can be properly determined whether or not it's something we already know about or whether it's something new. And if it's new, it needs to have enough physical evidence for a scientific description. Now, a good reminder from Dr. Heuvelmans, we're wanting an open mind as we investigate these creatures, but we also need some critical analysis. Unfortunately, we tend to see both hyper-skepticism and gullibility, which I think are two sides of the same coin. And unfortunately, you'll run into both of those in any investigation. But if you are closely examining the evidence and not jumping to conclusions about anything, there are ways to go forward and, objectively looking at the data. So we want to keep that in mind as we move forward. What do I mean when I'm talking about a lesser known mystery animal? Well, basically anything that's not Bigfoot, right? Well, yeah. I'm not talking here about, the big ape like creatures that you hear about, the Yeti, we're not talking lake monsters, sea serpents. We're talking about animals that you just don't hear about very often. No Sci-Fi Channel hasn't put out a movie of the week about them. That's essentially what we're talking about. A lot of times we're talking about creatures that aren't very big. And this is a little odd because, this quote here, Dr. Colin Groves, who's a mammalogist, he, back in the 80s, he wrote an article and suggested that, most cryptids are large terrestrial organisms. And we know now that that's not true. Most, if you're looking overall of the hundreds and hundreds of alleged mystery animals out there, most of them aren't that big, and they occupy a large range of habitat, a diverse range of habitat. There used to be a question, how big does an animal have to be a mystery animal, a cryptid? And there was some ideas that it had to be a true target for cryptozoology. It has to be reasonably sized. But we know that any animal of any size could be of interest to cryptozoology, as Dr. Heuvelmans points out here. They just have to have characteristics which distinguish them from the ordinary species that we are familiar with. And I want to point out this, what's highlighted here. Animals that are unusual enough to make them extraordinary. What do we mean by extraordinary? There's this really strange idea that in order to be a mystery animal, an animal has to be, incredibly out there. It has to be bizarre. It has to be monstrous. And that isn't even remotely correct. In the context that Dr. Heuvelmans is stating here, an animal just has to be different enough. It has to have some trait, some characteristic that makes it recognizable as something different from the normal species that that an eyewitness is familiar with. It doesn't have to be something, completely alien to them. It just has to be different enough. And we have several noteworthy examples in the cryptozoological literature about animals that are reported to be different, but aren't all that, are not all that unexpected. So but we see this definition of the extraordinary out there. And for example, here's a blogger who, claims that the finding of the Olinguito is not cryptozoological because there were no extraordinary claims made about it beforehand. Well, if you actually look at the paper describing this new species of Olinguito, you'll find that, in fact, there were some prior clues to a new species here, from particularly a zoo specimen. It was in a zoo, I think it was in Kentucky. The animal was distinct enough from the other, I think it was just other olingos, and there was some discussion about whether or not it might be, something different. Or at least it was recognized as being different from the ordinary species that was known. So, did it have to be, a purple green colored animal to be extraordinary, or something like that? They have to have spikes running down its back or anything like that? No, it was it had some behavioral differences. I think there was some, obviously a little bit of a size difference. There may have been other morphological characters that just didn't quite fit the normal template for what an Olingo was supposed to look like. And it was published in the zoo literature, several decades ago. But so the idea that it has to be something completely out of the ordinary just misses the point completely. You hear this idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's what we call baloney. The reason being that it's promoting subjective and opinion-based evaluations, and science attempts to be objective, not subjective. So, for a cryptozoological investigator, we're looking at a different maxim. We're looking, we should be stating that all claims, extraordinary or not, require sufficient evidence. You don't need extraordinary evidence, as if such a thing exists. No. We need sufficient evidence to back up any claim. Now, you can have an opinion, and you can have a belief, and that's fine. But if you're going to make a claim is an argument. And an argument requires sufficient evidence and a sufficient logical structure to it. So that's what we need to be evaluating claims by. Not whether or not, the claim, the evidence is extraordinary. Okay, well, let's get into some of the smaller mystery animals that I've run across. Now, this one's a little off-center. There's an interesting story here. Dr. Heuvelmans put this on his, I think it was his checklist of mystery animals, or used it as an example of a small, lesser-known mystery animal that actually was discovered. If you look in the literature, though, you're not going to find much about it. But it's a small coastal fish in the Mediterranean, a blenny. And if you know anything about blennies, they're not outstandingly colored fish or anything like that. There's nothing all that I don't want to say special, but there's nothing extraordinary about them at all. But this was a fish that had been heard about prior, and it was collected by a French ichthyologist. Now, I contacted this scientist, and he actually is well known under another pen name in cryptozoology. Years ago, he did some writing, and so he kindly gave me some background information on this. So it was interesting, but it basically follows this. This is a small mystery animal. He had found it. He'd run across it on vacation, basically, and then he had heard stories about it. When he asked around, he wasn't able to collect a specimen right away, and he asked around, and he found people who said, "Oh yeah, I've seen that fish, somewhere, along the coastline there," And so he went back, I don't know, it was a year or two later or so, and he was actually able to collect it. So, it doesn't follow exactly the cryptozoological methodology proper, but it's an interesting case of, yeah, some people had heard about, had run across this fish. But, there aren't that many people who are going to be able to recognize differences in, a very small fish like this. So I wouldn't hold this up as the banner for cryptozoology, but it's an interesting little story. This is actually one of my favorites. I actually ran across this story many years ago. The glowing spider of central Burma, or what's now called Myanmar. Basically, Barnum Brown, who was an American Museum of Natural History curator and fossil hunter, paleontologist actually, he would go on these digs to different parts of the world, and he was over in, central Burma, and he was out of his tent at night for, I don't know if he was walking down the trail or something, and he sees this little glow in a nearby bush, and, it looked different from, the fireflies that he's... So he walks over to it, and he shines his flashlight on it, and he sees that, in fact, it's a spider that's glowing. And, so he's surprised, and the spider is surprised, and it drops to the ground, and he loses it. So he wasn't able to collect it. But the story, he makes up a chapter in one of his in a book that he put together, and he published it in a journal, and there were some interesting stories that followed up on that from India. Actually, there was a certain part of India where people were saying, "Oh yeah, we've got a bioluminescent spider there." And I've seen a handful of reports from a few other areas like Australia. It doesn't seem to be quite the same thing, but this is, Myanmar. If anyone wants to go over there now, I think it's open. I don't know how safe it is, but, if you want to go out at night and look for glowing spiders, you might actually come across something there. Yeah, now, following up on that, there's the glowing moths of Queensland, Australia. This is another thing that interested me. If you know anything about bioluminescent invertebrates, that you would think, okay, why would we find bioluminescent organisms in, all these, in different organisms? Wouldn't they all be more likely to be similar? Like we see fireflies. It's not uncommon to find bioluminescent beetles or, caterpillars, that sort of thing. But beetle larvae, I mean. But if you look around, there is, for example, a freshwater snail over in Southeast Asia that is bioluminescent. There is a cockroach, or maybe a couple of very closely related cockroaches down in South America that have a bioluminescent organ. There is a handful of millipedes in California, and I believe there's one in Asia that are bioluminescent. And so, there are these small disjunct organisms, they're not closely related, but they do show bioluminescence, and it's a little weird. It's not like, you go to the bottom of the ocean and find all kinds of glowing creatures. But there's, over in, Queensland, and this is a rainforest area. The scientist, Gary McGuire, was collecting, had collected caterpillars that were glowing. And he was specifically looking for bioluminescent organisms of different types, whether it was fungi or, I don't know, beetles or whatever. But he found these caterpillars, and he kept them and they went into their pupal stage, the pupae, and that apparently glowed. And he had come across these writings then of these diaries, basically, of settlers in that area that reported seeing glowing moths. And he was going to raise these up. Unfortunately, the pupa didn't hatch for whatever reason, and so he was not able to confirm adult moths. And because of that, he also was not able to describe them. Now, I'm not sure what happened to the specimens. Unfortunately, Dr. McGuire died just a couple of years ago. So you can still find his website online the way he had it, but there will not be any updates on it because there is nobody investigating these bioluminescent moths, or so that's a species which frankly would be very cool to find, and we have a much better chance of describing something new. It's got a much better chance of being scientifically valid than a lot of the mystery animals that we run across. Unfortunately, there's just no one doing any research in it now. So that remains a mystery animal. Now here's an unusual little mystery reptile. I ran across this just in the last year or two. A naturalist by the name of Jan Roth, he had written a newspaper article, and it was posted online, and I came across it. He's describing what he's calling a black snake, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 feet, give or take, half a foot, and in this Colorado-Wyoming border area. And there are no known species from that area that should be racer-like, is basically what he's saying it is. So it might be simply a range extension of the racer, whatever subspecies is out there in that region, and that might account for the different coloration. Racers, if you know anything about them, are found, are actually fairly variable in color. You get both black racers and blue racers, and out west you get the, sort of greenish, the Mormon racers. And so, it might simply be that. It might be something that was introduced to the area. Snakes, sometimes, are accidentally brought into an area with, vegetation or parts and that sort of thing. So, whether it's something that's actually native or not, you actually have to have a specimen to look at. One good thing is it's highly unlikely to be anything dangerous. It's not like a rattlesnake or anything like that. So if you're out there, you just basically need to be quick, quick enough to catch one of these things. So it might be a good herp project for somebody. And here's another mystery animal. We've got fairly good evidence that it probably exists because we have a decent photograph. It was a diver off of the Gold Coast in Australia, photographed a pipefish, and he showed it to a local museum. They couldn't identify it. It was eventually, I guess, posted online. NatureServe biologists, they kind of keep track of species that are found everywhere, and they saw it and they decided to do a little expedition for it. As far as I know, they were not successful, but it's something that's definitely ethno-known. We know people who are looking for it now. It's an interesting idea whether this thing's out there or not, and is it something new? I don't know the specific traits for pipefish, so I wouldn't be able to tell whether something is new or not, but these guys do, and I would assume that they're going to try to collect a specimen for their museum. Now, this sort of moves into the concept of scientific speculation. The idea that cryptozoology is simply amateur science really doesn't grasp the fact that scientists are using cryptozoological methods all the time. They just don't necessarily recognize them as cryptozoological. We see here, scientists collect, examine, and discuss evidence to determine whether or not a new or allegedly extinct species exists. And we see many, many articles and papers on this kind of speculation. This is essentially cryptozoology. Just because it's a scientist doing it rather than, somebody, an Alabama farmer or a hiker out in California. Just because it's a scientist doesn't mean that it's not, cryptozoological. We see in other sciences like physics and chemistry and astronomy a great deal of discussion of how discoveries are made, because they want to study this idea of how discoveries are made, because they think that if they understand the process better, they can make more discoveries. We really don't see that in zoology, as far as how we you'll see a lot of papers on quantifying how many species are left yet to describe. You see a lot of papers like that, but you don't see a lot of papers on how scientists, how zoologists actually go through the process of finding new species. Other than, okay, if you're going to go looking for new species of ground beetles, here's how you set up a trap, for those and that sort of thing. But there are different ways scientists do this. This, a lot of times it is simply random chance. They're just setting up traps in areas where they think it have a high likelihood of finding the animals that they're looking for, the type of animal. But there's always going to be some sort of bias in what they are capturing. For example, if you're setting up a trap for beetles, then obviously you're not going to capture a bat in that area with that trap. So that is the type of bias that trap presents. Cryptozoology is just a much more targeted search methodology, because you have an idea of what you're kind of looking for. And, even if it doesn't turn out to be exactly, what someone thinks it's going to be, you kind of have an idea of, what steps you need to take to acquire the evidence necessary. And, that's all cryptozoology is. You kind of know what's out there. You've heard the stories. And scientists do this sometimes. You'll see, for example, let's start out with this one. Here's a toad that was photographed by a film crew down in the Dominican Republic just a few years ago. They didn't collect it, of course, because they were a film crew, not a bunch of scientists. But it was something that, they did not recognize. So a couple of herpetologists went out again, and they were very fortunate in being able to find it right away. So, it was a very quick and easy search compared to a lot of other mystery animals. But it was, in fact, we can term this a cryptozoological search. And I'm not sure whether or not it's been published, whether the species description has been published or not yet. Might be a bit too soon. Here's another search. People in an area, they were telling tales about these stories. They thought, well, these stories these crabs that they didn't recognize. They thought, well, if we don't recognize them, they must not be native, so they must be from Australia. They'd heard stories about invasive crabs. And, so the Zoological Survey of India went to this location, to this wildlife sanctuary, and found these crabs, and it turns out that, they were a completely new genus of crab, but they were native to the area. The only reason they hadn't been seen before is because they were only active, at night. They were nocturnal and during the rainy seasons. So, just because someone is native to an area, has lived in an area for a long time, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be completely familiar with every species that's in that area. So that's something to keep in mind. Here's a third similar story. Not of a new species, but of a species that has apparently gone extinct. A desert rat kangaroo from Central Australia, described in the 1800s, disappeared apparently until the 1930s when it was found again. But the colony apparently disappeared, and in an area, I don't know how remote it is, but I would assume it's fairly remote. But with only sporadic sightings for the next several decades. And then the paper that I ran across that had this information mentions that as recently as 2011, a camper in this area appears to have actually seen one of these rat kangaroos. And so it's an area where an actual expedition might turn something up if you have the funds and the interest in doing so. Of course, you'd probably need the Australian government's permission. I'm sure they are a little more restrictive over there. But, this sighting was actually published in a peer-reviewed journal, so it was kind of interesting to see that. We don't see a lot of cryptozoological papers in journals. Not because the information isn't out there that, zoologists could write it, but they prefer to publish, actual discoveries, not what might be a potential target for search. And we see that again with this Indonesian flycatcher story. We tend not to hear about mystery animals or possible species rediscoveries until they've actually culminated in a discovery. Like in this case where a flycatcher, which is a type of bird, was reported in Indonesia here. It was reported several times, and it was, recognized as being very different from the typical flycatchers there. But it wasn't until an actual expedition went in search of it that they were able to acquire a specimen. And I think, like it says, the specimens were actually collected by local bird hunters, not by the scientists themselves. But, they were able to get the proof that they needed to describe a new species, or I assume that they're going to be describing it. And here we have a story of a primate. You hear, well, that we never get any new primates, but if you look and you watch news carefully, you do see a fair number of primate discoveries, especially down in South America and Madagascar. But here's one from China, or Tibet actually, and a Chinese photographer took some photos of an unusual macaque, and they collected audio, which is where they got a sonogram from. And so they've gone ahead and described it based on the photograph, and they're then hoping to get actual physical samples for DNA through hair or feces. And that's, so they've gone ahead and done that. I'm not sure that most primatologists would be happy with that, because there's always the possibility that it's just a regional difference, a morph or something. But it's an interesting story, and it indicates that there are lots of alleged creatures out there, that alleged species. You just have to look around. Here's one. I wanted to throw this in here. I discussed this a bit further in an article for my bulletin, Biofortean Notes. This is a published booklet that I put out irregularly whenever I have enough articles and whatnot. I have a few different people who contribute. And the amphisbaenid is one of the major groups of reptiles, like lizards and snakes and crocodilians. But amphisbaenids, there's only one in the U.S. that's known. It's down in Florida. And but there are these claims, and it's in several different locations in Arizona, in Colorado, Nebraska. Very, very just a very few sightings, but very interesting sightings of these little worm lizards. And they're subterranean, so it's not something you would expect to see very often, but every once in a while somebody's they're known from Mexico, different parts of Mexico. There are some reasons why it would be difficult to expect bipeds in North America, particularly regarding climate. But the stories still need to be investigated. And I discuss this in Biofortean Notes. If you'd like to have a free copy of it in PDF form rather than the print form, you can sign up for my mailing list here at the URL there. Just make sure you click Cryptozoology, and that will be sent to you, along with actually I think it's all of the first 4 volumes of Biofortean Notes. There's actually plenty of reading material there if you're looking for something. But that will give you an idea of a mystery animal that's actually was sought by professional herpetologists for many years. And so it's something to look into. Again, just a refresher here. We want of what the methodology is. Again, we're looking for a specific, or we're targeting a specific mystery animal, gathering as much information about it, evaluating that information, and then hopefully finding a way to find physical confirmation. One researcher who does this very well, or especially the gathering information part, is John Worms. John lives up in Canada, Manitoba. He runs a little a park, I guess a campground there, and he also does a fair bit of traveling for the government, for a governmental agency. So he gets to talk to people in all parts of the province and collect some very interesting stories. And I've published his book on these strange creatures that he's run across stories about. Now, so I just want to cover a couple of them, just to give you an idea of the types of stories that he's run across, that of creatures that you may not have heard about, that kind of thing. The most interesting story that he's run across, I think, are his mini stories of giant beavers up there. Now, we know that the Ice Age beaver, Castoroides, was in the area, and we know, it was, in fact, about the size of a small black bear. And that's kind of what they're seeing up in this region. And he's run across these tunnel systems, not dams. It wouldn't be like a smaller North American beaver creating, lodges and dams and that kind of thing. But instead, this giant beaver kind of, has more of a subterranean behavior, which is kind of interesting. If you look in the fossil record, there are some beavers that are known to have had subterranean lifestyles. But I don't know that there's any literature on the Ice Age beaver doing anything like that. But it's it's kind of an interesting concept. And again, if you are interested in these stories, by all means, check out John's book. It's available on most online bookstores like Amazon and whatnot. Another one he's run across are these stories of beaver ducks. Basically, it's a little platypus-like creature. There are some differences. I think the tail is different. But there's no getting around the fact that the eyewitnesses that are describing these little animals, they're seeing something very similar to a platypus, and so it's just kind of weird. But he's getting it's not just a single individual having reported this. He's gotten a few different stories. And here's one, just to throw this in, that I think this is a fun story, but I tend to look at it more as not an urban myth, but maybe a rural myth. I don't know. The dry rat's kind of a muskrat-like creature that goes around very aggressive and attacking hunters by jumping on their faces, that sort of thing. It's a good story. I'm not particularly optimistic about its biological viability, but it's I like a good story. Here's another one. This one comes actually from is one of the more northern stories. Fairly far up into Manitoba, at least the part that you can drive in. This is the hunters apparently have found these tracks, round, flat tracks. They're not hoofed, like split hoofed like a pig's would be, and they're reporting kind of a single tusk at the end of the snout. There aren't a lot of stories of this, but John hasn't done this is an area where you're not getting to meet a lot of people from that particular region. There just aren't that many people up there. It interests me primarily because there was a small Canadian fossil mammal, kind of a rhinoceros-like, that actually had, it was actually, I believe it was a pair of small tusks at the end of its snout. It just kind of is reminiscent. If you're familiar with the idea of cave drawings of an ibex or something having kind of developing into unicorn stories, you can see how a profile of an animal with two horns might actually look like a single horn. And so it just kind of interests me. I think this would be a fun one to go after if you really like cold weather, which I admit I do not. But here's another one. Again, it's more of a fun, a tale. I would like to personally speak to an eyewitness, to get further information if there were any, for something like this. Beaver-sized frogs. We're not talking the giant beavers, but we're talking, that's still a pretty good-sized rodent. And, frogs this size, I'm not at all optimistic about that sort of thing, but it would be a whole lot of fun to find one, we do have, some very large frogs around the world. You could talk about your African bullfrogs and that sort of thing. But, this is something that would be fun to chase if you had the time. And whether or not these creatures exist, the stories certainly exist. We get a lot of different kinds of stories out there. And I do think that an investigator has a responsibility to collect stories, investigate and evaluate them the best that they can, and also to publish. And unfortunately, there are a lot of investigators who don't do a lot of publishing. They do a lot of collecting. They go out and talk to a whole lot of eyewitnesses, but you never hear anything coming from them. And this is a huge problem for cryptozoology because we are losing data all the time because researchers grow old and then they retire or die. We've lost a lot of material because the researchers, they spent decades talking to people, collecting stories and whatnot, but they don't do anything with them. They set up these little centers for investigation or whatever, and nothing comes of it. And nobody can continue it after they've gone because, they haven't passed it along to anyone. If you're familiar with Situ, that was started by Ivan T. Sanderson, one of the chief founders of cryptozoology. And while he was alive, he did a lot of publishing, but, he still had a lot of material that was unpublished, collected in their files. And when he died, they continued their publishing a little bit. The group got smaller. You had some inter-society rivalries and that sort of thing. Eventually, the files were stripped by visitors who kind of snatched what they wanted and then disappeared with the material. And then eventually there was just nothing left. And that's very unfortunate. There's a lot of material that's just gone and no one else can access them. So I want to encourage researchers to find a way to publish material. Make sure that you're going through the whole critical analysis phase before you publish. I wouldn't publish everything willy-nilly. Make sure that you have somebody looking over it, checking it over. But there are different ways to publish. While I have myself done some online publishing through, websites and whatnot, I'm not a huge fan of that. It's because they tend to be very temporary. Websites just don't last. And, paper is preferred. It really is. Newsletters, back in the 90s, every other investigator had their own newsletter that they were publishing. It got to be a little too much, admittedly, trying to keep track of everybody. Even just Bigfoot publisher, newsletters alone. But, today we've got online videos and that sort of thing, and that's okay. But, it seems to be a bit temporal and a little more difficult to access if you're looking quickly for something quickly. Journals, if you have enough material to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, please do so. That would be an excellent thing. We tend to think, oh gee, well, if it's cryptozoology, we have to publish in a science journal. Yeah, well, there are other options too. Keep in mind there are folklore journals out there. And I think there are some absolutely viable alternatives to still get into the published literature in journals that most people don't think of. Feel free to contact me if you want to discuss this further. I'm happy to do that. Books are probably the best way to publish if you have enough material. There are a lot of people who publish these short little books. I'm not a fan of those. I prefer to see someone actually, putting substantial effort and putting together a book. It's more than 80 pages or so. And not just your own speculation, like your opinions, your speculation, that kind of thing. We don't really need more of those type of books. We need books with actual data, the sighting reports, that sort of thing. Today, it's never been easier to publish a book. Maybe not so much with the large traditional publishers, but there are plenty of small presses, print-on-demand publishers like myself. CoachWhipBooks.com, that's me. I started out as a self-publishing, and then I branched out and I do a few other authors. I do a bunch of reprints and all sorts of stuff now. Ebooks are available. It's not that difficult to do if you want to publish through the Amazon's Kindle system. There's a little bit of a, you got to figure out a few of the techniques, but it's not difficult. And you actually, if you had everything written up and you could get it edited, you can actually hire someone to create the Kindle ebook for you. There are people who do that. Unfortunately, while it's never been easier to publish a book, it is still difficult to market a book. And while it's not that hard to get distribution through Amazon, if you're going the print-on-demand route or the ebook route or something like that, you still need to build a platform for your research. You're wanting to build an online presence because people need to know you're out there. Let's put it that way. There's really no point in publishing a book if you're only going to sell 10 copies. People need to know you're out there. You need to be willing to share information, to network with other researchers, and you might be able to collaborate with them on long-term projects and that sort of thing. But there are different ways of building an online platform. Personally, I started out with a website, strangearc.com. I haven't really done much with that website recently, but it's there. I've actually moved more towards a Facebook approach, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But I actually started the first general cryptozoology discussion list, email list, back when Yahoo Groups I think it was one list at the time, before it eventually got bought out. But I think there was a Bigfoot discussion list prior to mine, but I started the first cryptozoology list, and that lasted for about 10 years. Email lists are not quite as important today as they, as a means of communication. That eventually switched over to forums, and then later on to like Facebook groups and that sort of thing. I started self-publishing. Cryptozoology, Science and Speculation was my first paperback book. I did have a booklet published a few years before that, but this is basically my first book. I started out, I tried one publisher, couldn't get any interest, and decided what the heck. Print-on-demand publishing had just begun like the year before as, a possibility. And so I was trying it out, and it seemed to work, so I went forward with that. Eventually, I turned it into coachwhipbooks.com. I published a wide variety of books, but a few of my own are like Historical Bigfoot, which covers those kind of sightings. Varmints, which covers North American mystery carnivores. I have a book on boss snakes, giant snake stories in North America. Mokele Mbembe, that's a book by Bill Gibbons on his expeditions to the Congo region. Shadows in the Woods, most recently, is a book by a researcher into Bigfoot stories in Maine, the state of Maine. It's a very extensive book. Social media today, there's different options. I've set up a page, facebook.com/strangeark, that it's not a group, it's just a news page, basically. I just post whenever I run across anything unusual that I think would be of interest, whether it's about a new species discovery or something cryptozoological, or even just a weird color morph or something that hits the news. I'll post something on that. And that connects me to a fair number of people. But, you just need to get yourself out there. You'll run across people who have similar interests. And, just a few general observations. Unfortunately, it is true that Bigfoot sells better than just about any other cryptid story right now. We do see way too many speculative, opinion-driven titles. What are you going to do? There's a lot of opportunity, I think, for more extensive investigatory regional cryptozoology titles, just like John Worm's book, which basically is, almost all of it is about Manitoba sightings. He's got a lot of research up there. And I think that, there are certain regions of the U.S. or other regions in Canada, other places around the world where we just don't have a lot of material well documented. And I think there's opportunity there. And I prefer to see that, if a reader's going to pay $20 for a book, he needs to get his money's worth. Make sure that you're actually, giving him what he's paying for, him or her. And, there's stuff out there that investigators run into, and, even if you can't explain it, or, it might be of interest to someone else, even if it doesn't interest you. I'm personally very interested in mystery reptiles. And I don't mean lizard man. I'm talking about, mystery snakes and mystery, lizards and that sort of thing. So I'm always interested in hearing about that. And I realize that, most Bigfoot hunters would rather kill a snake than, collect it. But, expand your horizons a little bit. There's some interesting mystery animals out there that shouldn't be forgotten. And there are probably a lot easier to catch than, a 8-foot tall ape. So, anyway, thank you for listening. And by all means, if you'd like to discuss something, you can contact me through Facebook or my website at coachwhipbooks.com. Thank you.